Good morning. Today is the 29th of July 2022, and this is the third in a handful of anecdotes which introduces us to home economics, our shop manual way of being able to talk about so many different things. We started out by being normal and well-adjusted, which is our culture. We put a young couple into a 1950s household, and we realized we have to view that couple as a single unit. And then we realized that in our world, all of the manufacturing and farms and stores and even the recreation are all geared towards giving that young couple everything they ask for. Well, let's pause and then continue. When the person you're listening to was in school, the economic teachers would go up to the blackboard, they would draw an L-shaped graph, and they would say, this is a supply line, this is a demand line, and this is called a normal supply and demand curve. And this is as cheap as you can possibly get a product. They would talk about the reasons why, and they would say such things as, well, there's competition, and competition would bring the price down to the level of production. And there are other reasons. You have to all be in the same gang in the playground, and we have to will the good of another person. We have to try and make somebody else better off. That was, they say, as opposed to a monopoly supply and demand curve. And in a monopoly, there's a few people who control the good, and so they can raise the price, and when they raise the price, a lot less people could afford to buy the good. And if it came to something like food or housing, then bad things would happen. And there are rules. There has to be no competition. There has to be more than one gang in the playground. Somebody does the consuming and somebody does the producing. And the people in charge have to be scoundrels, or in this world they would be called malicious. The example they would give is our housing. Instead of a house being something that brings us out of poverty and into plenty, the house would be viewed as an income producing thing. Somebody would go out and buy a couple of dozen houses and they'd start renting it out to other people. And when they did, the price of those houses would rise. People would have to rent, they wouldn't be able to afford to buy, and over time they would turn into a peasant and property class society. It's worse than that. Psychology being what it is, psychology being the normal taken into the abnormal, or in one of our anecdotes, the idea of doo-wop music turning into Woodstock, it would go something like this. The people in charge would buy a house and rent it out, and then they would buy a house and put apartments in the back and rent those out. And then they would buy a house, put apartments in the back, and try and stuff as many people in there as they possibly could. And that's how slums are born. And so that would be considered the bad kind of monopoly. Then they would say, there is a good kind of monopoly, you know. In our shop manual world, a normal supply and demand curve is a kind of monopoly. It's just another kind of monopoly. In this monopoly, you would take the real estate attorneys that live in the foothills and collect rent from everybody, and you would run them out of town. Then you would take the criminal trial attorneys, the people who defend the poor and the oppressed, and you would insist that they live in a doctor's and lawyer's house, that they take Wednesdays off, and that they play in that silly tennis tournament they have every year, whether they want to or not. And you would insist on it, and you would insist on it at the point of a gun. A normal supply and demand curve is a dictatorial position. And let's pause and then continue some more. In the 1950s, there was a famous comparison between the United States and Russia, or the Soviet Union. They are two completely different cultures. Russia would have had one car company that made not very well-built cars to about 5% of the population, and it just so happens that about 5% of the population were members of the Communist Party. The United States had a completely different setup. They had three competing car companies, and those car companies were building big American cars for the American family. We had a huge middle class. I couldn't tell you the details, but I sure remember the point of it all. In the 1950s, I believe it was, Russia and some of the other countries, I think, came over to the United States, and they were given a tour of how we did things around here. And one of the things that stopped them in their tracks, one of the things that they had never seen, was the idea that we had such huge parking lots. The idea that a Ford plant would have such a large parking lot, they would have 1,000 cars in the parking lot. The idea that the people who went into the factories and built the cars were able to actually buy the cars and drive the cars. That was completely out of their radar. It simply wasn't part of European culture, and it's not part of communist culture. Remember, communism is a very strict peasant and property class society. They have a class of intelligentsia that does all the consuming and all the decisions, and they have a class of proletariat that does all of the producing. We had a completely different setup, which brings us to the point of this anecdote. And the point of this anecdote, that it's the proper role of government, especially when it comes to this sort of thing, to regulate parameters of competition. It's the role of the United States government to place the Pope in charge. For example, the Pope holds a dictatorial position, but he's not a dictator. You have to be the government that decides it's going to be God and country. You decide the Pope is in charge, and you decide that the economics are placed beneath the political. And in our example, you set things up so that there are 3 competing car companies, and they put a car into the driveway of that young couple we were talking about. And not just a car, but a big American car. We are our own culture, and we produce things for ourselves. That leads us to that gives us all the 4 things we need. We need to realize that we're a culture of normal and well-adjusted people, that we have home economics, the married couple, that the point of industry is to provide goods for that young couple, and the role of government is to regulate the parameters of competition. And we have all the 4 things we need. And so let's continue on in the other anecdotes.